turns out that the gap holding back women's health may have been hiding in plain sight all along. And the person to find it wasn't a doctor, but a 26-year-old entrepreneur with a background in machine learning and unanswered questions about her own body. I'm talking about Priyanka Jain, founder of Evvy, the company building the first and largest database of the vaginal microbiome, and the team behind Evvy AI, the first AI advisor for vaginal health. We're also joined by Nisha of BBG Ventures, one of Evvy's earliest investors, and the co-founder of one of the first funds to put a real stake in the ground for women and underrepresented founders back in 2014, before it was much of a talking point. We got into why leading with the opportunity is the smartest thing that an unconventional founder can do, what it actually looks like to build in a category that barely existed when you started, and how these two women ended up at the forefront of one of the most underfunded and overlooked spaces in healthcare. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome back to Brown Girls Money Moves, where we hear from South Asian women founders and the investors backing them. I'm your host, Bhargavi Varma.
Priyanka, Nisha, thank you so much for making the time to do this, and welcome to Brown Girls Money Moves. Let's start with what we do in the culture, which is we start with celebration. So I would love, Priyanka, to start with saying congratulations, because 2 days ago, I believe, if I'm right, 2 days ago, Evvy launched Evvy AI, which is the first AI advisor for vaginal health. So congratulations, and tell us a little bit about Evvy AI, and maybe that'll kind of start the conversation as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here, and so excited to be here with this group of people. Nish and I have known each other for a very long time, and she was one of our very, very first investors. So this is very fun for us. But yes, we launched Evvy AI 2 days ago. A lot of it comes from, and really the need from our standpoint came from the frustration that so many of our patients were feeling, honestly, putting our Evvy results into ChatGPT and just getting really bad advice about they meant and what to do next. Yeah. So similarly, we offer health coaching calls accompanied with our test. And patients have so many questions about their vaginal health, but how it relates to their hormonal health and their relationships and so many other parts of the female body. Well, we were just amazed by the fact that we had to get on the phone with somebody to give them access to the right papers, to the most scientifically accurate information. And when we dug into it, we found out the things that we talked about in the press release, right? That 60% of women's health questions are incorrectly answered by the existing LLMs. And we knew that if we wanted to scale access to the amazing knowledge that our team has built, we had to do it ourselves. And so essentially, the tool allows patients to ask their most intimate questions, ask about what's happening with their vaginal health, how it affects their sex, or how it's related to their hormonal health, or how to handle a symptom that they have, and get the most up-to-date, accurate information based on the most up-to-date scientific literature, as well as the learnings we've had from our over 100,000 patients.
This is something that is so needed, but we also want to make sure we just talk about this is not any kind of new product launch, new feature. It is not a small thing to get out to market. So just as a founder, how does it feel to now see this? I'm going to call this your baby. I'm going to assume Evvy AI is your baby. How does it feel to have this launched into the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's so exciting to just see, frankly, women using it and finding value in it. We've had so much more use of it than we even anticipated. It's actually drove a huge amount of new interest in people even engaging in Evvy in the first place, which I think represents the fact that women want, scientifically backed but accessible ways to get answers to their health. And so to me, it's every single time we give a woman an answer that she didn't have to wait for a human to respond to, she didn't have to get on the phone, she didn't have to get the wrong information. That to me is just, that's why we exist. So that's very exciting.
So what we always do at the beginning of every podcast is set up a scenario that may or may not feel relatable. And I will tell you, past guests usually say, oh, and they usually add a bit more and they say, oh yeah, this is totally something that happened in my life. So I'm curious about you. So let's say you were at a dinner party and you're approached by, pick either auntie or a Gen Z cousin. Okay, the Gen Z cousin is maybe a guy. Let's even make it spicy. And he's like, yeah, I just keep hearing auntie, Bobby, whoever. So they keep talking about this Evvy. What is this? And what is even vaginal health? isn't that just part of you? Like, what does that mean? How would you
Well, I'm
answer
laughing
that?
because I think the way I would answer it to an auntie is different than the way I'd answer it to a Gen Z girl cousin, and different than the way I would probably answer that to a Gen Z boy
Yeah.
cousin. Maybe Nisha and I could
Yes.
tag team how we would do this for
Yes.
different audiences. But I actually do have a Gen Z girl cousin. So, and actually, she interned at Evvy one summer when we were like 5 people, which was
Okay, we should shout her out. Hello.
I mean,
Hello,
the way
cousin.
I typically talk about Evvy to any audience is we are closing the gap in understanding of the female body and doing so with a consumer-first approach. So vaginal health is the leading reason that women go to the doctor in this country, and we are more likely to be misdiagnosed than correctly diagnosed, and we are more likely not to get better than to get better. So that is atrocious, and I think especially if the person I'm talking to is a young woman, I probably don't need to tell her this because she's probably lived it, right? And that so much of that comes back to a massive lack of data and understanding of our vaginal health directly, but also that the vaginal microbiome, which is what determines our vaginal health, is playing a huge role in our health outcomes beyond just symptoms and infections. And it turns out that when you have these pathogenic bacteria in the vagina, you now have inflammation and infection of your entire reproductive system. So if what you care about is fertility, whether that's infertility, IVF success rates, preterm birth, whether it's HPV progression, whether it's menopause symptoms, whether it's endometriosis relapse, whatever it is that you might care about as a woman, it turns out your vaginal microbiome is playing such a large role in those outcomes, and we are totally ignoring it today because it turns out we just never studied women in this country. And so Evvy is trying to bring better research to women in this country, but doing so by actually solving the problems that we have every day.
You know, as I listen to you talk about this, it also takes me back to conversations I've had with other South Asian female founders who are building in spaces that the category is new, that the research isn't there, the data isn't there. And I mean, this actually could really dovetail into the fact that, Nisha really came in early. But what was that experience like initially of like, hey, I'm talking to and having conversations about something that just isn't being talked about right now, at least in the space of building a company around it?
Totally. I mean, thank God people like Nisha exist, because let me tell you, most people that I was talking to did not look like us. And most people, weren't thrilled to get on a call with somebody who wanted to talk about vaginal health or the vaginal microbiome. But honestly, I think when you put the numbers behind the problem that we're solving, when you talk about the fact that 30% of women have these conditions, that they are misdiagnosed and recur more than 50% of the time, that you can predict 30 to 50% of IVF failures or preterm births, like I think that framing it with the data opportunity and framing it in that perspective allowed kind of everyone to come to the table. And by the end of the meeting, nobody is flinching when I say the word vagina, right? And so I think it was a little bit of how do you get people in the room and to understand the opportunity and not just lead with the kind of moral side of things, which often as a founder you want to do. You believe in the mission, you're doing it because you care, but I don't think that's typically where I lead from when I would be, talking to a new investor, because often you have to kind of start with, there's actually a massive business opportunity here. And I think that made people more comfortable.
I am going to repeat that nugget back because I really want that to be just captured, which is when you're building something that might feel unconventional to the founder that's listening, lead with the opportunity, and as much as passion that there might be behind what you're building, lead with the opportunity and frame it that way. Thank you for saying it like that, Priyanka. Nisha, I'd love to talk about BBG Ventures. And you co-founded BBG Ventures with Susan Lim. It is an early stage firm, so meaning, and I'm just going to put this in simple English because there's a lot of our listeners who are new to the space. So you invest in companies in the pre-seed and seed stages, which is the early stages of a company, sometimes idea, sometimes a little bit of traction, and I'm sure you can elaborate on that. And you bet on underrepresented founders. And I would love to hear you talk a bit more about the thesis, and especially in relation to the survey that BBG issued called the Mind of Polycultural America. Can you share a bit more about BBG Ventures' thesis and why releasing this survey was important?
A lot of this goes to why we back companies like Evvy, right? We launched in 2014 with the very simple thesis at that time that women were being undercapitalized as founders in venture capital, largely because investors looked a certain way and didn't understand the problems they were building to solve for the dominant consumer, who was also women. What we've seen in the country is really a passage from the monoculture to one where women have been recognized as a really strong economic force to now what we call the polyculture. And so the underlying thesis here is really who are founders who have unique lived experiences that will drive competitive advantage. And so it's natural to start with women. That has expanded over time given where we are going in the country. And we're really looking at, what are the behaviors, preferences, and priorities of Americans today? So actually, I kind of made up the word polyculture, largely because of my own upbringing in Australia. But, I grew up in a small country town in Australia. It was, very white country town. My parents were Indian immigrants. And I was a cross-culture kid, right? And in Australia, we describe ourselves as a multicultural society, but it's really one of assimilation. And I think what you have today, as you look at, the rise of now a majority-minority country, an aging population and a real spread of age demographics, we're in a state of the world where identity is no longer about one single thing. It's multifaceted, it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's always moving. And at any given moment, one part of your identity might be forward, right? It might be the fact that you're a woman. It might be the fact that you have a different race. It could also be your socioeconomic status. And so we were really trying to understand, has in fact that perception of identity changed in the country? Yes, spoiler alert, it has. And that different groups lead with different parts of their identity. And so from that basis, what then are the most fundamental needs that need solving for Americans? Where do they feel underserved? And where are they demanding new solutions? And so we looked very deeply at health, financial security, top two priorities for everyone. Employment and education. We also looked at climate safety and consumption. And those roughly map to where we invest as a fund. But, you talk about health as the number one priority in the country. But what we're really saying is there are very nuanced and important ways to build for different segments of the country. And health is a great example, right? The trust that women have in the healthcare system, the trust that people of color have in the healthcare system is very different to the broad majority of Americans. And then you start getting into these different pieces, which is precision and personalized health is a real number one demand in the country. And so, that gets us a little bit to why we invest in companies in the women's health space and in companies like Evvy. We've had a thesis around women's health for the obvious reasons, right? We started with a focus on women back in 2014. The women's health market as very narrowly defined across reproduction is like a $200 billion market. That does not take into account all the other things that affect women in a different way, right? Like heart health, autoimmune, diabetes, right? Then when you start to add those things in, it's like over 400 billion. And so there are very clear reasons that we should be investing in women's health specifically. But we've also had a long-term thesis, even well before we did this research, on precision medicine and the ability for data to drive different outcomes for healthcare in this country. We're investors in Spring Health, which was early to that. And so when we heard that Priyanka was bringing together, the first, not just the largest, but the first database ever of vaginal microbiome. And there's so much talk about microbiome, right? But she was the only person asking this question, what would happen if we had access to, and I'm going to remember from our investment memo, shotgun metagenomic sequencing to identify
Let's go.
Hundreds and hundreds of different microbial species. We thought wow, anytime you can get a proprietary data set, this is why a company like this requires venture capital, because to build this IP engine, right, this clinical engine now powered by AI is a fundamental shift for the category that we've never seen before. And so it's a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you for sharing it the way you did, because it was actually something I have to say as an investor, or just even as a woman entering this space, and I think I speak for a lot of the investors in Brown Girl Angels, we obviously are familiar with the problems, but I still think there's a lot of learning around femme health as a category. as an investable category. So thank you for that. I think it's really important to highlight this because this is true for both of you, that you're actually not from medical backgrounds. And I say that to say that it is possible to come into a space and come into these journeys as a founder, as an investor in these non-linear paths. And I'm someone that believes, and I say this from a personal bias of I'm not from venture and I'm building Brown Girl Angels. So this idea of being from a non-linear path is actually something that is a strength as a founder, as an investor. And I'd love for both of you to talk to that.
I talk about this question a lot because, frankly, I sort of fell into venture. I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer right out of university doing public and private M&A, hated being a lawyer, was really much more interested in the business dynamics of the companies that I was advising, went to Bain, did management consulting across like CPG, financial services, tech telco, and then I really wanted to be an operator, and so I joined AOL, which is where Susan Line and I paired up, and I ran strategy and operations for a 1,300 person group, 40 different brands, one of which I ended up taking over. It was a celebrity gossip website, also not where you thought this was going. And then I launched my own startup at AOL called Built by Girls, which was a platform to figure out, can you do advisorship and mentorship at scale enabled by software? And there was a B2B2C play. But I would say every moment in that journey fundamentally set me up for my job as an investor, which is I understand how to do the deals because I was a lawyer. I understand how to sell companies because I was in M&A. I understand how to do diligence and go really deep on a category very quickly because I was at Bain. And I learned both, running at the scale of Fortune 500 at AOL and building 0 to 1 with my website and then with my startup. And I spent particularly at that time a lot of time in consumer and learning how to build consumer brands. And I was doing like meme growth hacking before you even had to buy an audience on Facebook. And in fact, that was actually around the time that we met Priyanka because we connected Priyanka with one of her first jobs out of Stanford at one of our early portfolio companies. But the underlay, you started this with neither of us are in medicine. I actually went through a number of healthcare challenges. So I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed in my late 20s. So I have been through the healthcare system in a myriad of ways. I also suffered depression in my early 20s. That was the fundamental reason that I backed Spring Health. And now as an adult, I've also gone through the IVF journey. And so, you cannot underestimate, I think, how lived experience, particularly in healthcare as a consumer and a patient, can be really meaningful to uncovering what is required. But you do need that other side, right, to understand the commercial value and speak the language, as Priyanka does, of the commercial opportunity and how this is going to be a long-lasting and sustainable business.
Beautifully said about lived experience. Priyanka, I'd love to hear your take.
How inspiring is she? So Nisha and Susan truly connected me to my first job ever. When I was in college, someone connected us. I honestly, I should figure out who that was because
it was Aileen Lee at Cowboy and Ventures.
Okay, love that. Yeah. I was in some Stanford entrepreneurship fellowship program or something, and there were so many amazing investors who were kind of mentors to the students, and Eileen was one of them, so that's probably how this all happened. And I was dead set on I'm moving to New York, I want to be in that ecosystem, I want to try something different. And she was like, well, then you have to meet these two amazing women who you guys had only started probably a year before we originally met. Yeah. And I ended up working at a company called Pymetrics, which is an investment that BBG had made, and the team was probably I don't even know, 5 people at the time that all happened, which was wild. And I ended up being there for almost 5 years. I started as a chief of staff, ended up leading product there. It was a machine learning company focused on removing bias from the hiring process, which is something that I deeply cared about. I also met my husband there, so I owe a lot to you guys, basically. My personal background, I worked a lot in the nonprofit space when I was younger. I was a strong believer in, girls deserve access to basic rights, to education, to healthcare, but was very focused on kind of countries outside of the U.S. Was working a lot in India and Afghanistan and Malawi and Guatemala, and worked a lot with the UN Foundation. And honestly, I think the UN Foundation is amazing, and the Girl Up campaign that we built there, I'm still so proud of, and I think it's a phenomenal organization. But at the same time, I was like very frustrated by, one, the pace, and two, the scale at which we could have an impact. It felt like, okay, I can go raise $200,000, which was very hard to do as a 15-year-old. But then I was like, okay, cool. But now like 50 girls are going to go to school. And I was like, okay, but I'm looking at 70 million girls that are not in school around the world. Like, I don't understand how we're going to solve this problem this way. And at that time, I ended up going to this program called Singularity University, which was basically like, how do we match frontier technology to humanity's biggest challenges? And it was kind of the first time that I was exposed to the idea of science and technology being tools to solve problems that I cared about, and not just like tools for boys to have fun in the basement. You know what I mean? Which in my head was kind of like, oh, I don't care if you mix these two things and they change color. Like, I want to like do something that matters. And that was the first time I realized like, oh, these could be tools that I really used, and went to kind of Stanford with that mentality, and ended up joining Pymetrics, which was a perfect example of like, let's use machine learning not to codify and make worse the biases that exist in humans, but actually let's use it to remove that bias, which was something I really strongly believed in. And when I ended up at Stanford doing a lot of machine learning and data science work, ended up at a machine learning data science company for almost 5 years, and in that experience, I was on the side dealing with, as you described, many of my own personal health issues. For me, I also have an autoimmune condition, but for me, there was no diagnostic. There were no real treatments. And I was just amazed that in New York City, with access to the best doctors, the best testing, that I could get 30 tubes of blood drawn, do every test that exists, and everybody would tell me that your results are fine. Everything is normal. We can't figure out what's going on. And I was like, well, okay, you must not know what to measure then. Like, clearly your measurement tools are wrong if your measurements are telling me that I'm fine. And meanwhile, I was very visibly not fine. And as I dug into the research, that was when I found out the things that now very much underpin Evvy's mission, right? That women weren't in clinical research in the US until 1993, that women are to this day diagnosed on average 4 years later than men across over 700 of the same diseases. And to me, that's when I realized, like, this is actually fundamentally a data problem. Fundamentally, we have defined health and disease based on whatever predicts health and disease in middle-aged, mid-sized white men. And we have ignored all the female-specific unique biomarkers that exist in our bodies that could help us better diagnose, predict risk, treat disease as it uniquely manifests in women. And so, to your question, I was kind of like, wow, I wonder if my background in data science could actually be relevant to this, right? I don't know anything about healthcare. Honestly, I wonder if I knew more then, if I would have done this, because I honestly am like, everything's so much harder than you think it's going to be. I almost think that my naivete allowed me to do something that now I realize is really hard. At the time I started at Evvy, I think I was 26 years old. So I was very young, and I think it was very easy to look at me and say that this is a young person with no letters after her name that's starting a company that should have either an MD or a PhD or like at least an MBA or like something. And I obviously had none of those things. And what I always said, and I think is so true for all of the women who want to go into industries where people want letters after your name, is to be like, well, my expertise is in what the consumer experience should be. I am a patient who is saying that I have experiences in the healthcare system, and then I have experiences in every other part of my life. And I demand that my healthcare experience meets the bar of the experiences I have elsewhere. And I strongly believe that if the users and the patients and the consumers are not part of designing the solution, we're never going to have solutions that meet our needs. And so my job is to rally the capital and rally the experts and the people who can solve this problem. I don't need to be those experts. I just need to be able to raise the money and bring the attention to this so that the amazing experts who now work at Evvy can focus on this problem. Because who's to say they were ever going to solve the mysteries of the vaginal microbiome if we hadn't, put our own time and effort towards that. And so I think there are so many roles to play in innovation in any specialized industry. And definitely you don't have to be the expert to be the one who starts it.
I am sure you've been told this, Priyanka, and as an investor, Nisha, I am consciously or maybe not, the conviction in which you speak about what you're building really matters. And the way you described this just now, Priyanka, it's the conviction comes shining through. Now, I'm sure this is not your first time you've talked about it. Doesn't matter. But actually, you know what? That's part of it too, right? Talking about this, reiterating, all of this is part of the journey. And just not a question, just a comment about your conviction on this comes shining through. And actually, let me ask you, Nisha, like, Do you remember this kind of way of describing the company, of why this needs to exist, when you first spoke to Priyanka?
We had our investor meeting yesterday, and we did a brief presentation on Evvy without Priyanka there. And I remember it so well that, I was able to say that, Priyanka, I think, was one of the first people who understood that the vaginal microbiome was the missing link and that no one had ever tested it. And that through some experiences with businesses around her, she had access to a link that could help her find a way to test that, and that in and of itself, without being a doctor, was very, very unique. But that she was asking this very big question, which is like, what if you could diagnose, treat, and maybe prevent some of the most costly women's conditions through a single non-invasive test? Right? And even that, maybe that was not the way you described it then, Priyanka. I think that's the way you certainly describe it now. But the spark of that was clearly there, right? And every great pitch and every great founder that gets backed demonstrates that narrative arc from the earliest days, right? Even if the path to get there ends up being a little bit windy, or even if the articulation of that changes along the time, the question was, could vaginal microbiome fundamentally change the way we think about women's health in the country? And what Priyanka is now doing with Evvy, that is actually turning out to be true. I think we did see a spark of that, but we saw other things too, because we had spent a bit of time with Priyanka, even in her first job, and I distinctly remember being backstage at TechCrunch one year. And we were backstage because AOL owned TechCrunch, and we were speaking, and Priyanka was there, and we were there with Tim Armstrong, the CEO. And Tim's like a pretty imposing character, and we were just sitting there chatting, and Priyanka just plopped herself down and was like, hi, and started asking him questions. And let me tell you, that is the mark of a great. Every investor is looking for that spark in someone. Like, you might say, Priyanka, like, wow, like maybe if I knew what I knew then, I wouldn't have started the company. But you need some healthy level of like confidence and maybe not knowing, so that you can go into these conversations and ask big questions of people who you might not otherwise think that you would meet or have the right to meet. It's a combination of excitement, conviction, and confidence that opens the door for you, right? And every founder needs that. So, I think we saw a ton of that. It's chutzpah, right? Early on.
Well, I'm laughing because you guys are the same. I mean, that's what's so fun about having investors like BBG, and I strongly recommend this to every founder who I talk to when they ask about, our favorite people on the cap table. The investors who are starting their own fund, like, you guys are founders. Like, everything you're describing about us is also you, right? Because you guys are raising money. You're building a company and a brand, and you're building product, you know what I mean? And so it's just funny. I think that you feel such a difference when you have investors on your cap table who are also building, and they're not, sitting at their mahogany tables. It's the same thing, right? It's like literally the type of business is different, but you're still starting a business.
It's just kind of on the other side of the table going, I see you, because I know what you're going through. It's the relatability factor, 1,000%. I would love to ask you about Equal Research Day, because the timing is perfect. The live date for this episode is June 10th, which is the actual day that your team named Equal. Yeah, which I mean, when things work out like that beautifully. So the question is perfect to understand what is Equal Research Day, and that this is something that your team came up with, and I believe you won a Webby for it, or maybe I'm just giving you an award that I don't know. I believe you
gets all the credit because she does all of the amazing digital campaigns around it. But so Equal Research Day is a holiday that we made up, which is, as I'm sure people have heard of, Equal Pay Day or concepts like that, right? Where it's like, clearly there is a gap and we are going to use a day to raise awareness and to raise funds for the gap that exists. Turns out, as I described earlier, there is a massive gap when it comes to our understanding of the female body, and a massive gap when it comes to research that's been done specifically on women. And so June 10th is the anniversary of the NIH Revitalization Act, which was passed on June 10th, 1993, which was the first time that, as the law was written, that women and minorities were required in clinical research, which I mean, if we think about the intersection of even this conversation, right? Like, you could have a study of only white men, and then whatever came out of that study would be extrapolated to all three of us, even though not one person who looked like us in any possible way was included in that study. And that was until 1993. And honestly, the majority of modern medicine was created in the time frame in which women weren't in any of that research. And when we were starting Evvy 5 years ago now, nobody knew that stat. No one had ever heard that. It was like, I remember when we like looked it up and we were like, oh my God, this is crazy. 1993 is like way too recently for this to be true. And what's so sad is that it's not like, it's better today to some degree. Like, you have to show that you tried basically to include women in your research, but it's not great. And I honestly, in the past, 10 years, as we've had kind of like political changes across the spectrum, it's honestly just gotten so much worse. Like, we already, internationally, from a private standpoint, you see about 1% of dollars goes to women's health. So if you think about all of the biopharmaceutical spend, it's 1%. When you look at the NIH, in the best years, it's like, when all of the politics was on our side, it was 7%, but on average, and currently, it's more like 3 to 4%. And so these numbers are tiny, right? And we're already starting with a gap that is massive. And in what universe is that math equation ever going to add up, right? And so we started Equal Research Day as an opportunity to bring together the community, whether it's founders, investors, policymakers, researchers, media, tech, really to bring together the ecosystem to learn about this, to know the most updated stats, and think about kind of what is their role in closing that. And even from a venture standpoint, last depressing stat that I will share is that even if you look at all digital health funding, only 3% of it goes to women's health solutions. And within that 3%, as you described earlier, 65% goes to specifically pregnancy and fertility focused solutions. And so let alone all of the other things that compromise our health, those things are just not getting any type of private funding either. And so there is a massive gap. All of us play a role in it as patients in terms of where we put our dollars, as investors in where you put your dollars, as founders in terms of the problems you build towards. And we found it's just been such an amazing way to raise awareness with the broader community of the world. I mean, we've had some amazing celebrities get involved, people like Reese Witherspoon and Amy Schumer and Karlie Kloss and so many others, which has been so cool to see, but also to like actually try to move the needle. And so it's been fun to work with a variety of different policy agencies. I think I spoke at the first ever like congressional briefing on women's health, which was very depressing that happened in Evvy's lifespan. A lot more work to do. And I think now more than ever, it's so important for us to talk about it, given how much it's being gutted.
You touched upon something earlier, and even now with kind of the working across the different spectrum of industry, whether it's celebrities or policymakers. And you were saying earlier too, like an inspiration point for you, or not inspiration, maybe a question that came up for you was, how do you move from helping 50 girls to doing this at scale? Can't talk about amplification and not talk about social media. I mean, it was a viral TikTok that I believe was a part of this journey of understanding that, hey, women are looking for answers, and also not looking, to your earlier point, to not be gaslit in what they are coming and sharing as what they feel is not okay with their body. So the kind of the amplification through social and the amplification through marketing, I remember you saying on a podcast that there's actually some challenges as well around this as it relates to women's health, that you can say the word erections on air and that it's not a big deal at all. And then you talk about, vaginal health and people are like, clutching their pearls. And actually no woman's clutching her pearls. I take that back. No, they're clutching their golf clubs. I don't know. What's the equivalent? I'm not sure. I don't know. But, how has that been with dealing with those marketing challenges, understanding that you need to share the story of Evvy? And have you seen changes in that, just with where now femtech is kind of moving in this more accepted idea that, hey, we gotta invest in this, we gotta talk about this? Like, what have you seen in that? And so take us from the early days to now.
Fundamental gap that exists in women's health is just education. Women are searching for answers on their own bodies. We're trying to understand our health. And for better or for worse, the places we're turning are TikTok, Instagram, the internet. read it. And it's because, frankly, exactly as you said, when you go to the doctor, you're not always met with what you want, which is time, listening, empathy, opportunities, options, ideas. Sometimes you're met with, you're fine, right? And I mean, I think all of us have heard that on the other side. And guess what? When you don't feel fine, you're not just going to take that. You're going to go to the internet and say, who has felt the same way as me? What could this be? What could I do next? And so we always knew that online community and like that's where women are, right? Because the system's not serving us, we are finding each other and we are serving each other's needs. And I was always intrigued by the role that would play in our company overall. And now, I mean, today we get over 200 million views on our content every year. And what we have found is that the best performing content is really just education. Like really, we are just giving women access to education on their bodies. And we're using that as a top of funnel to build our own brand and platform. And I think that's been incredibly successful for us for many reasons. I think I said this somewhere the other day, which I still agree with, which is we're lucky to grow up in the age of TikTok and not of Instagram, right? Which is like on TikTok, people are looking for real and messy and humor and destigmatization. Like Evvy is not presenting like a beautiful, perfect friend. Evvy is sitting here to say like, look, we all are dealing with vaginal odor and discharge and we can laugh about it and we can educate you about the peer-reviewed study for what that means and what to do about it. And I think that we've been successful because we live at the intersection of really science and clinical. Like people trust Evvy because what we do is backed by data, science, and clinical people and data itself, but also cultural fluency. And we can laugh and we can talk about it and people can relate to us. And I think living at that intersection has been so successful. And frankly, I don't think that intersection even existed 5 years ago, but I think we're seeing that it is critical today. And the other piece of what you mentioned, which is absolutely a challenge we have had over time, and talk about another place that the industry has really come together, is around just generally censorship of women's health marketing and advertising. And as a founder who is primarily judged by the growth and efficiency of the growth of my business, it's really hard to do that when some of the largest marketing and advertising channels are not made available to you, or you have to like get around policies that don't let you say vaginal health but let you talk about erectile dysfunction, to your point, or you can't say pelvic floor but you can say ED, right? And I mean, even in New York City, I'm sure you guys have seen the many, many, many ads that exist for erectile dysfunction drugs, and the fight that amazing work by Alex at Dame to fight to even have vibrators for women put on there. You're just like the discrepancy between what we are allowed to talk about when it comes to women's health versus men's is just insane. And the parts of our bodies that have been stigmatized are thought to be about they're dirty, they're about pleasure, they're not about health. And for men, it's all, oh, this is obviously healthcare and they should be able to talk about it. And so I think we have fought very hard to explain that vaginal health is the number one reason women go to the doctor in America. This is healthcare. We have to be able to talk to women about that. And we've been really excited to partner with organizations like the Center for Intimacy Justice that are really pushing forward real change in that space. And I actually think Meta has changed some of its algorithms. TikTok has changed some of their algorithms. I mean, we've gotten ourselves whitelisted in various places to be able to do the ads, because otherwise you just turn off the most important channels to your growth. And so I think it's like an additional unfair advantage that you have in women's health.
You would say that we are seeing some progress because of the work of these incredible organizations and the work you're doing. I mean, that I say that to just kind of to add to the fact that there is change happening, but it takes people who are willing to build in spaces and have the conversations and push through. And, you know, for so many founders who are, who sometimes get discouraged, conversations like this are really important to hear. And in that same vein, I believe Melinda Gates actually shouted out BBG Ventures. I believe it was on, aptly, on International Women's Day. I don't know, Nisha, if you feel this way, but I'm tired of saying this whole 2% of venture going to women. I'm so over that. But in the same vein of seeing progress by the people doing the work, what have you seen as a shift in generally, very broadly, interest in women-led companies, femme health, and investing in those companies, not just amongst BBG, not just with BBG Ventures, but broadly in those conversations? What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, we were one of the first funds, one of two of the first funds to put a stake in the ground around backing women back in 2014. And actually that 2% number was still the same then. The numbers are a little different though. So that is 2% of funding goes to companies with women-only founders. When you add mixed teams, the numbers at that time were around 13%. That number has now gone up to about 20%. It's gone up and down over the last few years. Now, a lot of people don't like citing that number because they say, oh, that means you have to have a man on the team to be successful at fundraising. Look, I think we need teams building out there that have all sorts of perspectives. And so I think that level of progress is significant. I think what has skewed the numbers over time is market cycle. So every time you have a platform shift, capital converges. It goes to the same founder archetypes, the same pattern matching, and the same networks. And so, I think we saw that with Web3 and NFT, which is predominantly male-led. We have been seeing that with AI too, where the bulk of initial capital is going to foundation models and sort of enterprise point solutions or wrappers. What we believe is that as we come out of, we're in a peak, we're probably going to go through a trough. As we come into the stage of enduring value of the innovation cycle, that people with lived experience who look different are going to win the app layer. And so then capital comes back to those people. But there's no question that those numbers, those small numbers, have probably stayed low or flat because you have these mega funds kind of taking all that, right? So the pool has gotten larger, and a significant chunk of that pool has been taken up by the mega rounds of some of these largest companies. So has the picture improved in a dramatic way? Not necessarily. Has it improved some? Yes. And if you took the mega rounds out, would the numbers look a little different? I think so. I think what we've seen in a very positive thread is an explosion of funds led by female GPs, though many of them are emerging managers. And we know that the stats are that if you have diverse GPs at a firm, you will be more likely to back a diverse group of founders. And so, we've seen over time, I think, more female and diverse folks at large venture funds. I think that has been under pressure in the last couple of years for obvious reasons that I think would take longer than this podcast to unpack. But we are, I think, continue to be excited by the new funds that are popping up that I think, LPs understand that the next generation of founders is going to look very different, and they want VCs who look different and who think differently. And so even LPs understand, like Pivotal Ventures, and we're very thankful to have Melinda Gates backing, that if you want to have a diversified set of returns as an LP, you have to be backing GPs who look differently as well. So, I think the arc is long towards progress, as they say, but the more and more we can, I think, sit in the state that Priyanka described at the beginning of this podcast, which is, play the game on the field. A lot of female founders do not like it when I give them this advice. They say, you're telling me to act like a man or pitch like a man. That's not the advice. The advice is to quantify the problem for which you are building and quantify how your solution is going to drive absolute return. That is the key. And if you can do that and make it about the product and the opportunity, I think you have a real chance of, through the numbers, telling the story by the numbers of raising capital. And that's what's going to shift the dial, returns.
I could not make it through this interview without telling you, Nisha, VC firms like yours existing and me quietly cyber stalking everything that you were doing was such as part of the inspiration for Brown Girl Angels, because it is exactly what you said. We need women that look different to care about what founders that look different than what the norm is are building. So, I'm just, what's the word my lovely Gen Z son used? I'm just glazing. Priyanka, please don't laugh. That was very Gen X of trying to use the word at the right time, but truly it's inspirational what you're saying about being so early to it and putting a stake in the ground so early and seeing the shift. It's the reason, we need to hear more and more and see funds, whether it's Pivotal and funds like BBGB, continue the work they do.
I can't wait for BBG to be $1 billion fund. We need, it is a mind-blowing to me that it is not, it's the same way. It's why is it why can't BBG be $1 billion fund? Why can't we have the mega funds and the mega rounds being led by people like you all? And I think that's the next phase, right? It's okay, you guys started this trend, and now like I can't wait for us to get to a point where the LPs are giving you guys the $1 billion checks because you guys are better capital allocators for the America that's going to exist for the next generation.
A way better way to say it than I did. I was just fawning, but thank you, Priyanka, for saying it exactly how it's high time. And you know, the rewards go to the first folks that started something. And so yeah, so such a fan. Speaking of fans, we always end the podcast doing what is so important that we do naturally, but especially in a podcast, we shout out someone that we care about that we also want to highlight, because giving a platform to others is a big part of the culture, and it's a big part of what we do. So who is a brown girl founder, a business, a product, or if something doesn't come to mind right away, a person in your world that you just want to shout out, and give us a bit of info about them too?
I feel like I could give like 17 women for this. We have a lot of South Asian women in our portfolio. And obviously, like, Priyanka would be my first one, but she's on this podcast with me. So I'm going to go a little like off the beaten path. I'm really excited to see just the influence of Desi in common consumer goods. And so I've had like a return to roots of like Desi fashion, and also seeing just Ayurveda pop up in beauty, for example. So two of my favorite brands right now are Inde Wild by Deepa Khosla, and I love Deepa's hair oil, the Champi. And then I'm obsessed with Ranavat, Michelle at Ranavat, who, by the way, I think has not taken venture capital funding. Call me Michelle. She has built a beautiful, luxurious brand that I think is very covetable. And her saffron serum is like next level. You do not need vitamin C. You just only need that in your life. So those are my two shout outs.
Oh, I can't wait to go buy those products. You're going to have to send me those links.
Send the links.
I'm going to go with the maybe lame answer, which is I feel like I give my mom so much credit and so much kudos. I think, well, I mean, the obvious answer maybe is the better way to put it.
Not lame.
I think that sometimes it's easy as, you know, someone who grew up in this country to just like live, you know, in this culture and do things the way that everyone else does them. And I think when I think back to the fact that my mom moved here, having never lived in this country and built such an amazing life, raised us with, you know, values that I think are, you know, we all have our head on our shoulders. We're all ambitious but kind. And I think so much of that comes from her. And I think too, I can't imagine picking up my own life and moving to a country where I had never lived and, you know, didn't really know anyone. And I think when I put myself in her shoes, I'm just so amazed by the way that she built her life. And I think that when we think about, you know, the platforms that we want to build and the people we want to support, it's like, how do we elevate more people like her who maybe, you know, aren't the most in the news flashy people, but who are the people who really are holding the world together. So I mean, I definitely.
Can I just do a +1 because I've spent some time with Priyanka's mom and like I'm such a big Anu Auntie fan. So
she is like,
+1.
the kindest. Yeah. Sometimes you just like forget what matters in life and then you talk to her and you're like, oh, this is what matters. And I think having grounding women in life like that is so important. And honestly, like as I think all moms are, and as Nisha is to her own daughter, I think that having a mom in your life who believes in you unconditionally is like the ultimate foundation for anything you want to do in your life.
Shout out to Anu Auntie.
I'd be so excited about this podcast now. I'm gonna have to send it to her.
That's so funny you said that. When we just interviewed Talia Pillay from Orca Fraud. She's based out of South Africa, and we did, as we did with you as well, Priyanka. We've highlighted your podcast content and things like that on our platforms. The comment always is, "I sent it to my mom. My mom loves what you're doing," and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to send that to my mom. And then it's just, this is the circle we want to build. This is the circle we want to build.
All of us.
This is it. This is it. On that note, thank you so much. This was truly, truly a joy. I'm just inspired for the work that we're doing, and inspired by both of you.
For more insights around angel investing, South Asian female founder stories, and belonging to a community that builds and funds brown girl businesses, join the conversation online at Brown Girl Angels. As always, thanks for listening to Brown Girls Money Moves with me, Bhargavi Varma.